Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis.
So, dear friends, hello, good morning. I'm the co-chair of this very important session. My co-chair is here. And I know that I have to be brief. So I'm going to call Bertrand. And everybody will talk in moderation, but I would just like to mention something that matters for us. The Prime Minister in France has just solved the problem of drug addiction. Maybe you're not aware of it, but what Mrs. Bong, what she discovered, well, she just turned the fines that the police forces had to recover, and which were fines of 300 euros just for simple use. And of course, the subjects who had been fined, well, as you can foresee, well, 300 euros for young people living in peripheral areas, well, they cannot afford to pay 300 euros. So actually, the Prime Minister decided to turn this 300 euros into 700 euros. And this is supposed to solve the problem with drug addiction. Well, we will discuss about this later on. But I'd like to say that the problem with drug dependency and drug addiction and all the issues that you were talking about in this excellent conference here in Biarritz, it's all related to politics, especially in France. There's a number of wonderful publications here, and it's true that things are moving forward when it comes to science, to research. And now when it comes to the practical reality of each and every one of us, well, everybody moves forward the way they can. But from the political point of view, nothing is moving forward. And yesterday I already mentioned it. There's this political practice that does not want to really approach the problem of drug dependency. So Mrs. Bone has really made a huge gift for every one of us with this increase in the fines. So, well, thank you. Co-President, you have the floor. Yeah, well, never mind, never mind. I do have my computer, but it's at the hotel. Never mind. I won't use my slides. Well, I just wanted to talk to you about the international conventions and the way different substances are classified. International conventions are the piece of legislation for humankind. There are 193 countries at the UN, and well, most countries in the world signed the convention after the Second World War. And there's the convention in 1961 for plants, and then 1971 for psychedelic substances, and then we'll talk about ketamine, and then one other convention of 1998 on precursors and traffic. I'm going to start by saying that the international regime for drug control was implemented with the purpose of caring for public health and moral health of humankind, and with the purpose of responding to any medical needs regarding the use of psychotropic substances by also impeding the use of these psychotropic substances that are placed under control. So this is what the main authority declares. So I'm going to tell you what OICF is, because the idea is to try to explain how this classification takes place. OICF is the International Organization for Drug Control. It's an almost judiciary organization that was established by the Convention of 1961, which is a unique convention because it has encompassed all the other ones. And this organization is made up of 13 members for renewable period of 5 years, and they do not represent their government of their country. There's 13 members because of their quality, and they watch the implementation of the convention. And we can say that they are all prohibitionists, and well, nobody would ever go to OCF if they want to put in place harm reduction or legalization. So OICS talks about public health and moral health. Well, moral health is something difficult to decide and to define, but I would like to tell you how all substances are classified. Since the beginning, with the international conventions, like the one at The Hague or the one in Geneva, there were two main criteria. And it was danger that these substances would entail, and another criteria were the potential therapeutic uses. So morphine, for example, was classed as a narcotic, but it was not forbid because of its use as a painkiller. But this was not the case for cocaine. So what happened with cocaine? Cocaine was isolated in the 60s, and we started using cocaine for medical purposes because of its properties as an anesthetic agent. And this actually was used in ophthalmology and in ear and nose and throat specialties. But very quickly, some other substances were discovered, like lidocaine, xylocaine, which have the same properties as cocaine, as an anesthetic agent, but they do not have the psychotropic properties. So cocaine, which was classified as a narcotic, was then forbid by the conventions. But there are two main instances that play a role in this classification. The first one is the Narcotics Commission of the United Nations. It's the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, also called CND. This was established by the ECOSOC in 1946, and it's made of 3 states that are elected by the ECOSOC. So we're just talking about one quarter of the states that are represented in the United Nations. And the CND is re-elected every month of March in Vienna. And I was lucky enough in 2019 to attend one of those meetings of the CND. And then the other instance is the WHO from the United Nations, because they do have an experts committee on pharmacodependence. It's ECDD, Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, and the ECDD makes recommendations that are then submitted to the vote of the members of the CND. Now, when we when we were talking about the Convention of 1961, is for simple majority, and in 1971, it's a majority of 2/3. And you will see that this becomes a bit more complicated with this majority of 2/3 by the Convention of 1971. So actually, I have in all of this summarized in my slides that I'm not bringing today, but I tried to summarize the situation for you. Now, in the Convention of 1961, there are 4 tables, but there is one thing to be aware of. The 2 main tables that are more into prohibition is table 2 and table 4, and cannabis was found in table 1 and 4. So it was a particularly dangerous drug, cannabis, with no therapeutic purpose. So we have to bear this in mind. And then there are the tables of the convention from 1961, and there are 4 tables as well, but it becomes gradually, well, from table 1 to table 4, it moves gradually towards the least dangerous table. So then there have been some attempts for classification. For instance, for a substance which is very interesting, ketamine. Well, you know that ketamine is a very powerful anesthetic agent, and ketamine was considered as essential medication by the ATHS. It's a respiratory depressant, and we can use it for general anesthesia without having a complex respiratory assistance. So ketamine is a substance that is widely used in surgery, especially in developing countries. However, in 3 occasions, in 2006, 2012, and 2014, this great democratic country, China, with the support of INCB, requested ketamine to be classified in table 1, which is the most constraining table from the Convention of 1961, under the excuse that ketamine was used for recreational purposes. However, they knew that the WHO had always opposed to this, and then ketamine had not been classified. Now, recently, another interesting property has been discovered in ketamine. In just 24 to 36 hours, ketamine is able to modify the mood of people who have suicidal tendencies. Now, all antidepressants, even if they are infused, well, they take at least 15 days to 21 days to modify the mood of those people suffering from suicidal tendencies. So now, all of a sudden, we do have a substance that presents a whole new interest. Now, if ketamine had been classified as China wanted in table number 1 of the Convention of 1961, this would have been even more complicated. So in the end, the WHO was right to deny the classification of ketamine in table 1. So the second example I'm going to develop is a historical example. This is the reclassification, it's a partial reclassification of cannabis. Now, they knew that the ECDD, the Expert Committee of Drug Dependence of the WHO, had not examined the situation of cannabis for a long time, maybe for 40 years. But then in 2018, the General Director of WHO sent a letter to the Secretary General of the UN requesting cannabis to leave Table 4 of the Convention of 1961 so that cannabis could be used for therapeutic purposes, because we found ourselves in a very absurd situation. there was an increasing number of countries with legal frameworks that would permit the use of cannabis for therapeutic purposes. And there were trials talking about cannabis and its effects for neurology, for cancer. And however, we do have this piece of legislation for humankind that classifies cannabis as a dangerous drug with no therapeutic interest. And in the end, in December 2000, the ECDD voted for this, and there were 27 countries that voted for, 25 countries that voted against. So the proposition of the WHS was barely approved, and then this would allow cannabis to leave that situation and of a drug with no therapeutic interest. And now somehow we do have cannabis as a validated drug from an international point of view for therapeutic purposes. And I'm talking of a historical milestone because this is a reclassification. It's very rare that this happens. And the last example that I would like to develop, and it's an example corresponding to the future, it's, well, when will we have a reclassification of psychedelic substances? Because we find ourselves in the same situation as the one for cannabis before. So now there are 4 substances which... So 4 substances which are particularly used for clinical trials. There are 3 psychedelic substances, classical psychedelics, and 1 which is not psychedelic, and it's MDMA. Now, the classical ones are LSD, psilocybin, and dimethyltryptamine. And why am I saying that these are the classical psychedelics? It's because they interact in a specific manner with the 5-HT2A receptor of serotonin. And actually, well, we know that there's a large number of HT receptors, and these 4 substances are prone to lots of clinical trials for different indications. Indications for post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, well, you see that it's quite likely that if COVID had not happened, I'm sure that the FDA would have already authorized the use of MDMA in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, with all the veterans that come from Iraq and so on and so forth. I mean, there is a big problem in the States regarding this. But there's also people who are resistant to treatment in the case of depression, and this is the case of psilocybin. And there's this first wave of clinical trials with psychedelic drugs. And to me, there's also another important indication. It's the management of the end of life and the awareness of potentially deadly diseases for many patients. And there are many trials that show that if these people use psychedelic substances within a therapeutical framework, well, they are able to enjoy the pleasure of life until the end of their life. So the issue here is, when will the CND, the Commission of the United Nations, when will this commission approach this case of psychedelic drugs? Because there are these 4 psychedelic substances which all belong to table number 1 of the Convention of 1961, that is dangerous substances with no therapeutic purpose. So it's about time to remove them from that table, number one, and so that the International Commission validates the work that has been done regarding these psychedelic substances. In the end, there's so many clinical trials that have taken place. So where would the problem be? Well, you know, there are not so many countries that run clinical trials. It's mainly the US, Great Britain, Switzerland. So we do hope actually that Switzerland, which has the most enlightened policy regarding drugs. Oh, I know, I have to finish soon. But, well, sorry. So the challenge is very important because in this situation, when we're dealing with substances that are classified in the same way as cannabis was classified before being declassified. You know, we're talking about these psychedelic substances that are classified, and then it's very complicated to remove them from that table, and it's very important to, very complicated to access these substances. And of course, these clinical trials are quite costly, and well, we need them to happen because we want to have some kind of statistical weight. There were some trials made in the first wave of psychedelic drugs, but of course, the sample was very reduced. I mean, it was samples of like 15 people. So if we want to be convincing, we need much larger cohorts. So I'm going to go back to that declaration that I mentioned at the beginning. The INCB has always used a weapon, which is name and shame. For example, Switzerland has been subject to name and shaming by the INCB, but there's a need to reform, and it's only giving the possibility for these clinical trials to take place with these substances that have a very important potential therapeutical use. So it's a shame that science is not listened to, and we can wonder whether the main concern of the INBC is the moral health of humankind. But actually, of course, in a world without drugs, this is taken for granted. Thank you very much. You were even better than with the slides. So, ladies and gentlemen, after having heard this brilliant presentation by Bertrand LEBEAU, and well, nobody knows what the classifications are really, and I would like to remind here that what took a great effort for all of us who are here today was to really try to shake a little bit this classification. And there's this report by Rock, who put in table number 1 alcohol. I mean, we're not talking here about alcohol or smoking, but here we have the reputation for alcohol and cigarettes for being national products, and these national products are bringing a lot of money to the state. So that's why the classification was shaken, and we realized that talking about something that leads to 50,000 deaths per year, 50,000 for alcohol, 75,000 for smoking. So now, could this be considered as a substance that we are proud to use? You know, we need to understand this. So this really shows how difficult it is to access this kind of tables of international organizations. Now, Madam, you have the floor. And I think we're right on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be presenting some results of a survey that has been carried out with political scientists from Paris 1, Pantheon, Sorbonne, and Quebec. So these are the first results that are going to be published, I think, fairly soon, and they look at what legalization of cannabis has achieved in North America, what the situation has been, and particularly from the point of view of public health. Just a word about the perimeter of the study and the method. We chose 6 jurisdictions, 3 in the United States and 3 in Canada. And the idea was to study and compare the models of regulation of cannabis, which are quite different. In the United States, we chose the state of Washington, which was one of the first states with Colorado to legalize cannabis in 2012, with opening of the market 2 years later, Oregon, which was part of the second wave of legalizations, and California, which legalized it in 2016. In Canada, as you know, since we talked about this in a plenary session yesterday, it's a federal law which legalized cannabis, but with distribution and sales models which are different in the 13 provinces and territories of Canada. And we chose British Columbia because its regulation model and the sales model is a hybrid model with private and public players, and then Ontario, where everything is private, and Quebec, where everything is public. It's a monopoly. So the angle for the analysis, it's comparison, and I'm not going to go into the details of the comparison because, as I said, there's a publication, but these are the main trends that we're going to be discussing, which come out from a survey based on 4 types of sources. First of all, of course, in-depth analysis of official data, the regulatory texts, the reports that are commissioned by the authorities, a review of the literature, and a wave of more than 71 interviews, particularly with the regulatory authorities in each of the jurisdictions, the public health professionals, the administrations responsible for cannabis regulation in one way or another, and also researchers. We also went to do direct observation. We visited some production sites, sometimes large-scale infrastructures for cannabis production, transformation plants for infused products with THC or whatever, and then we looked at the shops. We went to 10 to 15 shops in each jurisdiction to compare the model adopted by the legalized sales in these states and provinces. First of all, a word about the trajectories that reform has taken. In the 3 American states that were studied, it was always through a referendum that cannabis legalization was approved, whereas in Canada, it was a legislative process, which was then deployed, at least with regard to distribution and sale in the different provinces. But some of those provinces were hostile to the idea of legalization, but they were constrained to implement it. That was the case of Quebec, for example, which set up a fairly restrictive regime as a result. Yesterday, again, we mentioned during the plenary some of the common goals of these reforms, first of all, which were to dry up the black market and cut the grass under the feet of the dealers, which is a poor pun, and also to weaken the crime rings. That was one of the first goals. And this then protect minors, and thirdly, reduce the risks connected with consumption and improve public health by better verifying products that are consumed and by allocating some of the tax revenue to the expenses involved in prevention and care. So the first thing that characterizes these regulation policies for cannabis is that they give rise to a process of manufacturing public policies, which is partly copied on the regulation of tobacco and alcohol, but not completely, because there are specific constraints for cannabis. And I mentioned that yesterday in the plenary session. It's more complicated to regulate cannabis than alcohol or tobacco. There's also a whole series of constraints that bear on this regulation. The fact that it is forbidden internationally, as Bertrand recalled a moment ago, even though since 2020 the therapeutic value of cannabis has been recognized. That wasn't the case for several decades, and in particular when the first states introduced their regulation systems. So international conventions, which are binding to set up a system which, for example, enables the banks to finance the cannabis companies. In the first years, the banks were very reluctant to support investors in the cannabis sector because they were afraid that they would be taken to court for money laundering. So very practically, these prohibitive conventions do have an effect. And then federal prohibition, which is still the case. There are certain states out of the 50 which have legalized cannabis, but they have an issue with this federal prohibition, which prohibits the export of legal overproduction of cannabis to other states within the same country. And the third type of constraint is within each of these states, the place that was given to local authorities, which can opt out from any form of implementation of points of sale on their territory or production infrastructure. Local authorities have this prerogative of prohibiting the implantation of trade or production of cannabis on the areas for which they have responsibility. The second point is that public health is one challenge amongst others in all of those systems. Clearly, you need to distinguish between the different states of the United States and Canada, because in Canada, the production and the health standards are controlled at a federal level by the health authority, the equivalence of the Ministry of Health. In the United States, that's not at all the case. There's no federal control. And above all, the regulatory authorities in states, public health has a very small place. It is at best consulted in the state of Washington, for example, but is sometimes completely absent from any decisions taken to regulate cannabis. So what does make a difference in the place that is given to public health is the degree of progress towards a privatized system with marketing, which is sometimes given 100% to private operators. That's the case in the United States. It's not always the case in Canada. And the idea of a business-friendly model. That, I think, is the cursor which enables us to distinguish between the different types of regulation. The third important point is the modes of action which are implemented to regulate cannabis. We have the classical tools to structure the market and to professionalize the cannabis sector, because the idea of legalization was to ensure that the sale between people would remain prohibited and illegal transactions would be neutralized to the benefit of legal systems, which could be completely controlled by the state, with operators who would be approved with a professional license. And of course, that license could be withdrawn. So there are verifications. There's a system of traceability with software applications and IT security systems, which could be used by something like the NASA and so on. And I'll show you in a moment a few photos of the safety checks and security checks. When you go into a production infrastructure, you have a badge to go into each of the rooms, in the production and treatment or processing of cannabis. And of course, the staff in these infrastructures are verified. They should have no legal background of crime, and there's controls as they go in and out of the workplace. The second mode of action in the classical tools, so it's also tax. I didn't talk about it much yesterday, but it's a central point. As for alcohol and tobacco, of course, there's behavioral tax, the idea that there are taxes on sales which are designed to limit the amounts that are consumed. And these taxes are very variable from one state to another. In the United States, it goes from 10% in Maine, for example, to 37% in Washington state, which is the most restrictive in the United States. So you can see that there's an order of magnitude of from 1 to 4, more or less. On the modes of action, the profiles of the regulatory bodies, which I mentioned yesterday, in the United States, it's very often the tax office, because expectations in terms of tax revenues are very high in the country. Third point, restrictions. And again, you can see yesterday's PowerPoint as a replay. There's the idea of having controlled access to the market for consumers and operators with authorizations to sell and consume, which are very confined to certain spaces. For example, in the United States, for a long time, there were no cannabis lounges. You could buy cannabis in points of sale, but you couldn't consume it on the spot. Now, California has set up some cannabis lounges, but it's not the case in all states. And in Canada, there's an ongoing debate on this question. For the moment, it's confined to lounges or particular events connected to cannabis, but it's not generalized at all. So the question of places for consumption remains an issue, because you can buy the product legally, but the places and circumstances in which you can consume the product are relatively circumscribed. Last point on modes of action are penal sanctions, legal sanctions, as legalization of cannabis was, of course, poorly perceived internationally. The first states that took this step, like Uruguay, were pointed out by the OICS that Bertrand was talking about a moment ago. And there was a form of international reprobation. And this meant that you had to plan for exemplary legal sanctions in case, for example, of sales to minors or association of under 18s with dealing. In Canada, the penalties were increased for this kind of crime, and it's now 14 years of imprisonment. And so the idea is that the prohibition should be even more severe for access to under 18s, but facilitated for over 18. So this is a slide I already showed, so I'm not going to show it again. But just some photos now to show what the legal offer of cannabis looks like in the urban landscape in North America. First of all, in the state of Washington, in Seattle. The first point is that these are shops which are open at night, which is not the case in Canada, or at least not as long and not as late in the evening. You can see that these are shop fronts, which are fairly sober, not particularly encouraging, but information about the age of authorization on the left. Uncle Ike's, you have an example of the first shop of what has become a chain of shops, which is in an area which is currently in a process of gentrification in Seattle. And there are cars coming up to purchase the cannabis. And one specific thing in the United States is ID checks at the entry, which are systematic, however old you are, even when there's no doubt that you are over 21. You still have to show an ID card. This is in Oregon, in Portland, in a quarter which is undergoing a process of gentrification as well. On the left, a fairly banal-looking, commonplace-looking shop apart from the cannabis leaves. And on the right, you can see the kind of game with the gaps in the law in Oregon, because this is known as gnome grown, a pun on the confusion between the home growing and the kind of biological short circuit production of cannabis. And it's also an appeal to younger people through the figure of the gnome that you can see more or less everywhere around this shop. And in California, third example, some shops which have a shop front, it's not always evident that they are connected with cannabis. You see the blue color on the left. If you didn't have the cannabis company brand name on the left, you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify the shop. In the Castro area of San Francisco, the color code of the LGBTQI zone is there with the Apothecarium shop. I was able to go into the shop with different spaces inside on the left, all the goodies and candies, which are completely forbidden in Quebec, but authorized in all states of the United States. A lot of colors and shapes of cannabis-infused products with sugar, candies, because sugar is also an addiction in the United States. On the right, a series of cosmetic products with a more cozy space, a lounge, where you can also find profiles of users, which are quite difficult, those in the grayer zone. Different spaces in this shop with counters, sales staff to give advice, to check the IDs, and to manage the flow of customers. Another example on the left, drinks which are infused with cannabis. On the right, chocolate and mint pastels. So there are more pastel colors rather than the green color, with almost the presence of cannabis is not self-evident either by the form of leaves or the color. Still in the United States, this is inside the nectar shop I showed you a moment ago in Oregon. The products are classified. There's a diversified offer classified by category. There's food on the left, the cartridges on the right for vaping, with a lot of choice and colors and marketing. Here, all the varieties of grass and cannabis, with a bud tender who is somebody who is there to give you advice depending on the different flavors that you're looking for in cannabis. And on the right, pre-rolled joints, which are a market segment which has progressed particularly quickly and is aimed at consumers who don't want to roll cigarettes or not used to rolling their cigarettes, with the idea of extending their client base. So I've got 2 minutes, so I will conclude with this little game here with the ambiguities of the law. I said in the United States, as in Canada, protection of minors was at the center of the reform, but there's always an offer which is being developed, which multiplies things that appeal to the under 18s. On the left, it looks like something from a cartoon strip, rainbows and promotions, which are prohibited in Quebec and most of the provinces in Canada. So this is an appeal to young people, to minors. For example, Harry Potter has become Harry Pothead on the right. And this is for cannabis in Canada. A whole series of references. And just to give you an idea, we tend to think that in the United States, it's the far west to a certain extent. Some states are more careful, more prudent than others. The state of Washington, for example, sales of cannabis in jars, the cannabis flowers, is completely prohibited. So in the shops, you'll see very precise descriptions of what you have concerning the variety of cannabis you're buying. I'll move over quite quickly to the little contrast with Canada, shops where the shop front can't be seen from outside, and they won't see that it's a cannabis shop. Obviously, when there's cannabis in the name of the shop, that's a bit of an open secret. And then consumers cannot touch or smell the products. So there's a whole series of strategies which are set up to valorize the products, but ensure that they're not something that you can touch by the consumers. For the producers, this is what happens. These are infrastructures which are extremely large scale with different types of rooms with ventilation, lighting, and humidification. The interesting thing is the level of the plants. You can see that this is a process of standardization of products in the legal market because the plants all have the same height when you go from one room to another. And then mechanization, again, which is being introduced with legalization. Here you have the first machine to roll the joints, the Juana roll. All of this is configured and monitored with all the usual IT controls, but 10% of the joints come out with some kind of poor production. You can see at the top. So this means that you have to have manual, unqualified, sometimes clandestine workforce with their production goals that you can see displayed at the back that come into that. So the capitalist system, the American capitalist system, works on the way that the cannabis market has developed. Last point on advertising, which is completely forbidden in Uruguay. Where it is possible, you can see that there are some interesting things to observe in the United States. Most often, advertising emphasizes innovation, the novelty of the products which are being proposed. But this is quite the opposite. It's the idea of normalization, which is put ahead. Stoner is being crossed out on these adverts, and you also see Mad Men, which of course refers to the series Mad Men and the medical side. And the word stoner has been replaced by entrepreneur, officer, designer. And perhaps the last point, it's a bit recreational on the codes and celebrities that are used to promote cannabis products. You can see a range, which refers to Bob Marley, and Snoop Dogg as a brand has just come up with snacks with cannabis in them, and Mike Tyson, who's invested in cannabis and has produced sweets, candies in the form of an ear to recall his exploits in the ring. Last thing, as a conclusion, just coming to my conclusion, the fact that these are new public policies which aim to achieve a transition of the black market to a legal market within the third wave of legalization in the United States, a new type of advocacy, which is to repair the injustices linked to the war against drugs launched by Nixon in the 70s, to have a program of positive discrimination which will focus on the social and ethnic minorities that were particularly discriminated by the war against drugs and prison and so on, to help them to move into this market and to limit the cost of entrance into the market, giving them support so that they can convert to the legal market. And the last point on this slide, the new challenges for public policies in terms of protection of the population, because you can see that the fiscal lever is essential to orient towards the various types of regulation and the effects that are observed in states where you have very high levels of tax on cannabis. You can see that the levels of consumption are progressing much less, and that is an interesting result, and it's conclusive with regard to this study. And the other point is the environmental effects, which are still underestimated, which are now being taken into account in the public debate in the United States and in Canada, with the idea that growing cannabis on an industrial scale can become a problem in terms of environmental impact. And this is a theme which we're going to be talking about a lot in the coming years. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. After this paper given by Mrs. OBRADOVIC, we're going to move on to from the United States to Spain.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here It's a pleasure to be here again, Jean-Pierre and all the team. Thank you. I'm going to speak Spanish. This is harm reduction in Catalonia. It's a policy under continuous evolution. Now, in the afternoon, Pat O'Hara will tell you a bit more about the history of all of this, but I wanted to show you this slide to show you that we have moved from the 70s, in which we had a model based on the moral paradigm, and we've moved into a model based in the paradigm of abstinence, which is either you fit or not. I mean, either you're abstinent or we're not going to treat you. It's also a paradigm based on public health, and this is the paradigm in which we're moving now, and it's really focusing on the patient. I mean, and we're not going to judge the patient. We understand that our role is to motivate the patient and that relapsing is part of the treatment, and you have to reincorporate the patient into the system regardless his or her state of consciousness and motivation. So this is the network of drug use care in Catalonia. I'm not going to delve into detail, but I would like to tell you that every year 14,000 people initiate their treatment in this network. And here, well, we're saying that in 1992, 50% of the onset of treatment in this network were related to problems with heroin, so 50% in 1992. Now, today, heroin comes in the 4th place after alcohol, cannabis, and cocaine. So I'm going to tell you about this harm reduction model that we have developed for many years in Catalonia. And I'd like to stress some elements here. First of all, we want to know the areas in which drug is used, because we want to go there with mobile units, with educators. We want to go to the use areas. And then we have harm reduction centers, which are called centers for warmth and coffee. And in these centers, we provide screening for infectious diseases, access for hepatitis C treatment, education for health. This is an amicable place. It's a place for active listening. So we have 19 centers, and we see 5,000 people every year. And thirdly, we have these outreach programs, proximity programs. This is social services, health services for drug users. We have 8 mobile units. In Catalonia, there are 8 million inhabitants. So this is just to, to let yourself make your calculations. And we have 11 teams that are specialized in what's happening in the streets. There's a very important program that we have developed since the beginning, since 1992, and it's the syringe exchange program. At this moment, we have 685 points for exchange syringes, for the program to exchange syringes. And the idea here is to dispense syringes in a flexible manner without conditioning this to being returned. I mean, every time a person needs a new syringe, they must get it. And we also want to train all the people who are involved in this. And one kit contains the syringe, the needle, water, 2 wipes, and also a little recipient. So we have dispensed 1 million free syringe kits per year. This year, for example, we're dispensing 700,000 of those kits for free. And we, besides the centers for coffee and warmth, and besides the centers for supervised drug use, we have also incorporated primary care into all of this. That is, first-line doctors can also distribute syringes. Another very important point, it's our OD prevention program. This is unique in Spain. There's no such thing elsewhere in the country. And now what we do is, well, we dispense these kits with sterilized gloves and a mask and a control system and naloxone. We have trained 4,500 people, professionals and users, and we give every user naloxone and syringes so that they can inject in the case they suffer from an OD. So I think that we have been able to revert at least 600 overdoses, which may have been fatal in the last 3 years. So I think that this is a very important program that allows us to reach very vulnerable people. Of course, there's always this previous training that we provide. And there's another important thing here, access to antiviral treatment, for instance, for hepatitis C. We have developed a strategic plan for drug users with the idea to diagnose and to treat in the same place, in the same healthcare center. In other words, the drug user does not need to go to the hospital. All the screening and the diagnosis and the treatment are provided in the same center. So this has allowed us to reach a lot of people. The most important hepatitis C reservoir in Europe is the community of drug users. So that's why we wanted to target this community. And that's why we want to avoid the visit to hospital. I mean, we have moved the treatment towards the healthcare center. And this is also another important measure that we've taken in recent years. There are 15 rooms for drug use, for supervised drug use. 13 of them are in harm reduction centers, and 2 of them are mobile, in mobile units. And 2,500 people can benefit from this every year, and they can use their drugs in an hygienic manner with everything that we provide. Of course, except for the drug that they must acquire themselves. So the use is supervised. So we have 120,000 uses. 67% of them are injected and the rest are inhaled. And this year we have introduced a very important program, which is the testing. I mean, when you get to the supervised drug use room, you're given a kit so that you can inject the drug. We offer you a hygienic space and a space where you can be relaxed and where we can detect the case of an overdose. But on top of this, now we have incorporated the test. In other words, we can analyze the content of the substance that you're using. That's how we can, for example, check whether your drug has fentanyl or not, and what kind of substances it contains. So it gives a lot of value, clinical value, and also precious data from an epidemiological point of view. Another very important thing is that we want to leave no one behind, and we want to provide attention and care to everybody. So that's why we provide this health card. This is the card that any individual, I have one myself, but with this card in Catalonia, you are allowed, even if your administrative situation is illegal, even if you're a homeless person, regardless your administrative situation, with this card, you can access any health center in Catalonia. And not only as an emergency, but also in terms of long-term treatments. And this is very important. It's a perspective for public health that is so important. And over 50,000 people have benefited from getting this individual card that we provide to absolutely everybody. And then we support the users, of course. We support the organizations of users, because we know that the best way to focus on patients is that these organizations become part of our strategic harm reduction program. So here are some of the associations and organizations that get support, and well, we celebrate certain events with them. Another very important part of our program is residential care. We put in place this hotel with the occasion of the COVID, actually. This is a social hotel. It's a community space. It can host, it has hosted 400 people every year. And actually, it's for people who are homeless, and they can have a space where they can eat, they can sleep. And so it's a hotel that is converted into a social care center. And this includes also the room for supervised drug use and supervised alcohol use. Many of these people are alcoholic, and we show them that if they are in a supervised setting, they can drink better than when they were in the street. And this is a very important change as well. So 400 people benefit from this hotel here in Barcelona. Something else that is very worrying for us is this early aging of drug users. We're also working on this. We are working on the cognitive deterioration that these people suffer from. And we want to see what kind of special needs they have, because we need to bear in mind that 60% of the people initiating the treatment are over 50 years old. So very often we're going to have 8,000 people under methadone treatment who will be 65 or over, and they will be living in residences. So that's why we wanted to anticipate all this situation. Chemsex. Chemsex, we have heard of this in the conference. We are very much concerned about the use of drugs during sexual rapport. And we see that in Barcelona there's been an increase in the use of methamphetamines, and on top of cocaine and alcohol in sexual relationships, especially in clubs and sex spaces between men. And that's why we have designed a very important structure for prevention, for harm reduction, for care and assistance, so that we can take care of the situation. There's also slam sex with the use of methamphetamines. So I wanted to say as well that we want to see how we can increase the range of opioid agonists in the treatment. This is the number of people that we treat every year with opioid replacement treatment, with opioid agonists. We're talking about 7,000 people, and 90% of them receive methadone and 10% receive buprenorphine. But you need to bear in mind, since 1991, do you know how many different medications we have for drug treatment or maintenance or stabilization? This is all we have, actually. Since 1991, since the beginning of it all in Spain, we have methadone, buprenorphine, Nolam, because it failed, and then buprenorphine and naloxone and long-release buprenorphine. or extension released buprenorphine, and there's nothing else. So that's why we want to reflect on this topic. I mean, and there are certain people who cannot quit. I have actually used half the time of the other speakers. But yeah, that's why actually people cannot quit. I mean, we do have supervised rooms, but we do not offer in the end what the users may want, which is to quit. So in this regard, we see that people who are treated in our centers, well, they're more stable, they have more risk, and they have a more vulnerable social situation than any other users. You see that 68% of people under treatment and 48% of those who are under treatment right now have accessed these supervised drug use rooms. So actually something's failing in our treatment. So we would like to consider the treatment with diacetylmorphine, or we would like to see a favorable positioning of treatments for heroin in people who do not respond to treatments with methadone or buprenorphine. This year in Catalonia, there was this double-blind trial with buprenorphine, oral morphine, and methadone, and it gave wonderful results. There's evidence that this can work, and only 3% of the people, in spite of all of this, only 3% can benefit from heroin replacement treatment. And we're talking about Switzerland, Denmark, Norway. So in Catalonia, we are considering to pursue this line of work. And we did a small trial with the 3 conditions: people who are under replacement treatment with a dose over 60 milligrams per day in the last 3 months. This is the minimal therapeutic dose. We want to see as well if this person does not comply with the therapeutic objectives. Maybe this person is consuming injectable methadone or other substances. And then there's another criteria of vulnerability situations. And with all of this, we can take 10% of people who are under replacement treatment. In our case, we would be talking about 700 people who would be susceptible to use heroin with a much greater effect than what they use with methadone or its replacement. And there's also an option about cannabis, but I'm sure that Milton will refer to this. We're working on cannabis reduction. In the last years, there's been a law, and the national structure of the state presented an appeal, and it was waived. And now we want to really pay attention to visibility, the perspective of public health and human rights. So, well, this is the end of my presentation, and I think that it's very important to commit to public health, but also human rights care, because this is, a dual situation, and we need to target this population. So without these policies, it wouldn't be possible to do it. Thank you very much. All right, so the co-chair introduces himself. So it was fantastic. So it's an honor, but I just want to give you the role of chair.
Good
well,
morning,
hello,
everybody.
hello, everybody.
It's an honor.
Well, it's an honor for me to
participate in this panel.
Share this panel. No, this is not the presentation. You will just listen to me.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation.
But
I've
it's
written
all
everything
written
down, and here it is.
So
I would like to
I would
thank
just like
Jean-Pierre
to thank Jean-Pierre and all the team, and I would like to thank the work of the interpreters for facilitating communication. I'm going to speak about policy as well.
Talk about politics.
And
I talk about France as well, but
I'm not going to talk about France, but I'm going to talk about the political debate that needs to take place so that we can break
with the
this dogma
that has been explained by other
Yesterday,
speakers.
I was listening to Ruth Dreifuss. Because, well, we were in Vienna for 10 years, and I would like to start by mentioning a philosopher who is 102 years old, and in a very important article published in El País, Edgar Moreno said, "The goal now is to save humankind. And for this to happen, we need to change our way of thinking and living. The idea of metamorphosis is richer than that of revolution, and it brings hope for a better world." So this is quite a hopeful declaration. My reflection stems from the fact that math teaches that in order to solve a problem, you need to place the problem and to really pose the problem correctly. Maybe it's about time to admit that there's another way to control substances, and this control should never undermine the fundamentals for men and women in terms of providing services of public health, and it must not undermine human development, a fair and sustainable human development. So I would like to address you all with all due respect for your clinical contributions, for your scientific research in the field of dependency and addictions. I must recognize that many of you were precursors of many different developments, many different positive advances, just like Joan COLOM synthesized very well, and you were able to break an old model. I'm here with a background in psychopathology, and I was a professor of community psychopathology, but I am a political activist as well. I was appointed National Secretary for Drugs in the first left-wing government in Uruguay that was led by an oncologist, Tavares Vázquez. And then I had other colleagues like Pepe Mujica, and I was leading social organizations, and we led the regulation of marijuana. I was a member of the Commission on Narcotics, and I was also a permanent representative of Uruguay before the OIA. And I had the honor to represent my country, and I had the honor to participate in the decision to legalize cannabis and to confront all the problems that we encountered. And in 2008, together with Jorge Vázquez, who was the brother of the president, when Uruguay became a full member of the Commission of Narcotics, well, we were re-elected 6 times, and we fostered the declaration that was announced 60 years after the Declaration of Human Rights, and it proposed to regulate the instruments of human rights with the regulation also of substances. And this was a very hard political and diplomatic battle that was about to fail until that moment where we were requesting nominal votes. And I was able to finalize that cycle at Anglaise 2016. That was a general extraordinary assembly of the United Nations, where there were a Latin American bloc that had been coordinated. And these led to small developments towards a new world consensus on this topic. And it was all about trying to find not a definite solution to the problem of drugs by promoting a dystopic world free of drugs, but rather promoting a series of ideas that could be the onset of a metamorphosis for a more sustainable and fair development and the respect of human rights and the preservation of public health. Maybe the problem with drugs is not properly approached. It's always determined by electoral campaigns, and these campaigns are addictive. And maybe the dilemma between prohibition and legalization is a false dilemma. Maybe the key of the problem is not there, because certain prohibitions are necessary. In the case of the tobacco market, this has been paradigmatic because the substance is not prohibited and not criminalized. The only thing that has been regulated is publicity about it. So this is considered as a market regulation. I would invite the audience so that you can watch the documentaries by HBO, The Crime of the Century, or in Netflix, Little Medicine. I have to say that I'm not getting any commission from Netflix or HBO. Or also a series called Dope Sick. And here we can appreciate that oxycodone, which is provided by many labs with corrupt practice of FDA and the Department of Health and Justice. Well, this was promoting the sellers of OxyContin and those who said that OxyContin was not addictive. So you can watch all of this in these documentaries that I mentioned. In other words, the pillars in the world of drugs, illicit drugs and illicit traffic drugs, well, these is, in terms of the market economy, it is absurd to have this black market, this illicit market based in total prohibition. And this is already affirmed by Milton Friedman and by other economists. But actually, the truth is very telling. In Latin America, the war against drugs has led to 1 million deaths, just like President Gustavo Petro in Colombia said. So it's mainly young casualties. And it has also led to massive imprisonment. And prisons are the school for criminals. I mean, they're imprisoned there, and then when they're released, they are still soldiers at the service of arm and weapon trafficking and drug trafficking and people trafficking, because organized trafficking does not only concern drugs. And we have this real toxic substance that poisons democracy and society. I have to say that Uruguay is an example when it comes to regulation of the market of marijuana, but it has also been an example for money laundering and cocaine traffic. So this also exists in Uruguay and in all the region. So the conclusion is obvious. The backbone of organized crime is still standing, and it's still a profit for many. So what needs to be regulated is the market, and not only the black market and illicit market of drugs, which is now regulated by organized crime and repressive agencies, because these are the two that are regulating the market today. But the market should regulate itself. I'm not opposed to the functioning of market economy, but I'm just saying, and this is actually what other leaders understood, I'm just saying that regulations are at the service of a healthy economy that can manage the risks of crisis like the one we had in 2008. So actually, even the purest of capitalists knows that at a certain moment, regulation is needed. I'm not talking about the regulation of the illicit market. This is absurd. A market with no regulations whatsoever would be like this ballad of Goethe that was commercialized by Walt Disney in the fantasy. It's the ballad that says that the apprentice who does not master the job will be like an apprentice without control, and this will lead to negative consequences. The international system of substances can be referred to the first convention of substances that took place decades ago. And in that occasion, China had been humiliated by powers in Europe that flooded China with opium, and then there were two wars. And Great Britain invaded Hong Kong. And then came the prohibition on alcohol. And the results of this dogma that became a policy were very radical. I mean, with the prohibition on alcohol, the only thing that was created was a skyrocketing consumption of alcohol and corruption. And this is very well documented in Hollywood films. And the Unique Convention of 1961, just 3 years after having voted the Universal Declaration, did not even mention human rights that needed to be protected. Actually, if we read the text of the three conventions, we will only find one mention of the word human rights in Article 14 of the Convention of 1968. The preamble of the Convention of 1961 says that the aim of the Convention is the health and the well-being of humankind. And the aim is to guarantee the medical use of controlled substances. And finally, they talk about the need to fight against drug dependency. But in the Spanish version of the convention, we talk about the physical and moral health. But in the English version only refers to the well-being of humankind. And actually, the International Commission for Narcotics says year after year that 65% of humankind do not have an adequate access to opioids to treat pain. And this is the result of a dogmatic conception that prevents the use for medical purposes of controlled substances. In other words, there are many states which are transgressing the convention, not complying with the convention because they do not guarantee the access to opiates. It's not only Uruguay and Canada that were taking those liberties. there is a lack of compliance of the conventions, which mandate to guarantee the medical use of controlled substances. And amongst the positive advances, in 2016, well, we have the achievement that, well, we could make 2 agencies of the United Nations to participate, and they presented a document called Politics for Drug Control and Human Development. So they talk about this human development on top of public health and human rights. And there's this paragraph that was very much discussed, and it was quite problematic in the final document of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And I have to say that the United Nations have had 30 special sessions of the General Assembly. 3 of them, 1998 and 2016, dedicated to the problem of drugs. In 2016, we achieved a very slight step forward because the paragraph says that we recognize that there are persisting challenges, new changing challenges that need to be confronted in conformity with what has been established by the 3 conventions that offer the states sufficient flexibility so that they can implement national policies regarding drugs that will take into account their priorities in conformity with the principle of common and shared responsibility. So this is a small opening. It can be discussed, of course, but it's a slight step forward. And I'm saying that in the last consensus, it is admitted that there is enough flexibility to give priority to national matters, to domestic matters. As the chief of delegation, when I was preparing the vote, I was really raising 4 topics, and actually, we regret that the Assembly has not been working on the derogation of the death penalty related to drug use. And actually, we failed there, and there is death penalty for drug use in many places in the world. We also regret that there has been no position stated against decriminalization for personal consumption. And the fact that there has been no honest evaluation of the action plan that we established in 1998. Well, I should be finishing. And this drafting of the foundations, we also regret that only the text on harm reduction and risk management was accepted, even though it has saved so many lives. But well, fortunately, life has its satisfactions. In March 2022, so last year, the representative of the drug office of President Biden said that the US was starting to incorporate harm reduction in order to confront the crisis of opiates, which leads to 100,000 deaths per year for overdose. The last General Assembly of the United Nations was celebrated under the Secretariat of Kofi Annan. And that assembly approved an action plan, an absurd action plan, according to which in 10 years the world would eradicate all the plantations for cocaine and for opium and cannabis. Kofi Annan toasted for a world free of drugs. I have to recognize the intellectual honesty of Kofi Annan. In April 2016, before the General Assembly, he recognized his mistake. And he published an article in the Washington Post, which talks about why it is time to legalize drugs. I would like to recommend you to read this article. In Biarritz 2021, I was declaring the approach, well, the right to pleasure, the right to managing the pleasure. And today we see that there are very important experiences regarding the use of psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs. And the right to pleasure is one of those pleasures, the right of enjoying our body, the right to life, as much as we do not attempt against other people. So the criminalization for personal use of drugs is a violent attempt towards, violent attack towards people. And what was launched by President Nixon was something that we also suffered in Latin America, and it led to 1 million deaths. So it's about time to have this metamorphosis and to preserve human rights and human development. Anyway, it's about time to fight against corruption, which is the most addictive drug and the most harmful drug that penetrates in democracy and that undermines coexistence. So finally, there's this declaration that was written in a leaf of cannabis, and it says, these truths are obvious. Men are created the same, and they are attributed with some undeniable rights, like freedom and the search for happiness, the right to seek happiness, and the right to get to happiness, which is a social good. Thank you very much.
Pardon. Mais j'ai encore un mot à vous dire. Ne partez pas tout de suite. Nous avons, après l'excellent plaidoyer de M. Romani, encore quelques minutes avec Mme Ruth Dreifuss qui va vous parler de la façon dont on a conçu la lucha. Alors, d'accord? D'accord. Bon. D'accord. Non, on avait dit 1 heure. Mais tu retardes toujours. On avait dit 1 heure sur notre...
So we have a few moments now to see Mrs. Dreifuss, who's going to say a few words now.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait justement dans ce même
perhaps after what you have just presented, perhaps we could also talk about the political approach, which meant that it was possible to convince our politicians, in particular in Switzerland, explain how the Swiss were at the vanguard of a risk reduction, harm reduction policy. Well, very often we wonder why Switzerland, which is a small country, which is rather a conservative country, has succeeded for 3 decades in modifying its practice and its laws concerning drug policy. First of all, it's a conservative country, but it's a very pragmatic country. And when a crisis breaks out and we don't know how to confront a crisis like that, there's a fairly large availability in the public and receptiveness to the idea of trying something else, or trust those people who say we're going to try something different. But it goes further than that. Swiss politics is characterized by a participative regime where not only the parties participate, but the population as a whole take part in major or minor decisions. We vote on a number of things. It's almost our national sport. We can vote sometimes 4 times a year on some very diverse and sometimes very complex issues. And it's absolutely essential to create the basis for decisions which are acceptable for the majority. And once again, the majority of the population in the end, because the parliament can take a decision, but it can sometimes use a referendum or have recourse to a referendum. And a decision that's taken by the parliament may be rejected by a referendum. So there's an obligation to find a consensus. And I prefer the term consensus to the term compromise because it's really a question of the result of a negotiation, the result of light being shed on the different interests and looking for something which could be acceptable by a large majority. In this sense, it's also important to stress that the government of Switzerland is a government of all the major national parties, and it's collegial. That is, decisions are taken by all of its members, even though they may come from a solid right wing right to a socialist party, which is one of the most advanced, perhaps the claims in the strongest terms its rights throughout Europe, because the parties are free to ask for a lot, and the members of the party in the government are responsible for negotiating, and the result is very often what you might call a compromise. Sometimes it's an unhappy compromise. Sometimes you have to accept it and begin work again so that it can be brought once again to a vote at the next possible occasion. So the public needs to be informed. And that means the public doesn't only need to be informed, but it needs to be convinced, and to be convinced not only by political leaders, but convinced also by scientists. And it is in this sense that the drug policy in Switzerland has been accompanied by a large number of assessments of what was being implemented. Some of these measures have been rejected. For example, the idea of bringing the consumers together into one place to be able to reach them, but also to be able to defend the rest of the town, for example, or the districts of a town. This was a catastrophe which taught us a lot, but fortunately we have found other solutions without losing the contact that was possible for the consumers in what we call needle parks. But pragmatics and a search for a consensus, these are 2 characteristics plus scientific evidence, which is required when you make a decision. In the case of drug policy in Switzerland, I would add another point. I've already briefly mentioned it, and that is a health emergency. At the end of the 1980s, Switzerland had one of the highest rate of AIDS in Europe and a massive increase in heroin injection. So a solution was absolutely essential. And when I say it was absolutely necessary, it was a question of life or death. And it was then the first consumption rule was opened in Bern in 1986. And I would insist that Bern is rather a quiet, conservative town as the capital of the country. And there were other consumption rooms. There have been syringe exchange programs and other measures, drug checking, of course, measures to ensure social management and psychological support, and the substitution therapy. We had a very long experience with methadone. I think we were pioneers in Europe for substitution therapy using methadone. And we observed, and the doctors told us, and we listened to them, that not everybody could remain in methadone treatment, that they were abandoning the treatment, they were dropping out. And so we said, why? And I think that's the great merit of some of the doctors in the field, like Andre Silverstein, to try and give heroin, medical heroin. And it was a project which was followed up over 5 years by a scientific team, which showed that it was a perfectly valid treatment. I think there we were pioneers, and other countries have followed us. And once again, we have a proof that it works well. So those are the main innovations. But once again, what counts, perhaps as much as the innovations, is the philosophy which underlies all of that. This philosophy is very simple. Life matters. In other words, life of the drug users is important, it matters, and we want to maintain a contact with trust and create a situation in which we've abandoned the illusion of a society without drugs, which is an absurdity. We have the possibility of taking action. Unfortunately, I would say that the experience that has been acquired is very much connected to injection and to heroin. And there are new substances, there are new modes of consumption, and we need to find new solutions. We have currently, unfortunately, a population which is beginning to consume crack, and it's a population for which we had not yet been able to find all the solutions. But in my city, for example, we're going to open a lounge for these consumers, because for the moment they are disturbing the existing departments for other drug users. And we're going to, first of all, look at their greatest risk, and the greatest risk is dying of hunger. It's of being totally exhausted because they no longer sleep, because they get dehydrated, because they don't drink anymore. And the first response must be there. If they continue to let themselves die because of dependence of a very addictive and powerful and frustrating drug, as soon as the effect begins to wear off, then other measures are necessary. So we need to work on that. And once again, the substances change, people change, the age of the people involved changes. And perhaps one final remark on that question, we have a very difficult problem to solve at the moment, a major problem, but a nice problem, and that is the consumers of heroin of the 1980s and 90s have got older. Some of them are going into retirement homes. Others are no longer able to come and collect the heroin that's prescribed for them. So it needs to be sent to their homes, and we had to develop that during the COVID crisis. But also, we're going to have access to heroin in old people's homes and other medical and social homes. It's quite a problem. And if if we hadn't acted earlier, then some of these people would have died. So the people who are still here are the best, of course. So I'd like to, before I release you for lunch, I'd like to thank you for having showed us a very comprehensive view of what's been doing in France, the international organizations, these offices that very few people know. And in the United States, Madame, where marketing perhaps has personally shocked me a little, but that's what happens if we go to complete opening up of these substances, beginning with cannabis, of course. There will be this kind of rather spectacular marketing, and there will also probably be countries where the economy will be comparable to other economies. It's not so poetic, but that's no doubt the road that we need to follow. We need to continue. Then we have Spain, and Catalonia, of course. Catalonia has given us a lot of hope in this day-to-day practice and is scientifically monitored progress. Thank you. And I'd like to say to my compañero Romani, I was struck by his decision, very Latin American, by all the perspectives that he's offered. Thank you very much. Now, we're not going to, are we going to discuss? If you do have questions, then of course you can do so. Yes, or otherwise you can go and perhaps have lunch. But Jean-Pierre, I've done what you asked me to do. We're on schedule. Thank you. There is a question, as usual, from the same place. So please go ahead. So I have a question for Joan. A few years ago, in this place, you presented a question on oral heroin. And I think you deduced that you have perhaps studied what you spoke about earlier with patients. I'd like you to talk about the difficulties, the hindrances. I saw that the results were good and you obtained a good result. What is preventing you from taking this further and just saying to patients that they have the possibility to access oral heroin? I think that was the road forward. I think you spoke about that. Different from what happens in Switzerland or in other countries where it's injectable heroin, it's medicalized. Here, it looks as though you have chosen oral heroin. So I'd like you to say why and what are the obstacles to developing this. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, to begin with, we carried out a clinical study, which we shared with Mr. Miguel Casas, a study that we did a long time ago. We compared morphine and heroin and oral methadone, and we saw that it was perfect. Nobody could identify the substance that they were taking. They said, you're going to have to give us as many doses of heroin, and you're not going to be able to keep up the pace. And the second day we could stabilize, and neither the patients or the professionals knew what they were taking. So we had some very good results, and that's how we decided to go forwards. We thought that we had enough evidence at the moment. We need to translate this into practice, but the barrier is that today Catalonia doesn't have the competence. We cannot give heroin, or whether it's oral or not, we can't do it. We need the Spanish agency, the drug agency, to enable us to do that and to give us the authorization. And we're working with the Spanish drug agency so that they will enable us to at least test this, and on the basis of experiments in our country and in other countries, we don't need more studies for this kind of patient. The patients that I've tried to identify, that is patients who have had failures with methadone or other things. They're just living through failure after failure. And others, even if they have a continuing treatment, they continue to consume other substances, people injecting methadone. We believe that this represents 10% maybe of people who take opiates, and that there's maybe 700 people. Those 700 people could benefit from this policy. And that's what we sent to Madrid. We said, we have 700 users who could benefit from what they really need, and particularly heroin. And that's what the situation is at the moment. So another question? There is another question at the back. I think that the greatest enemy is ignorance. And the problem is that ignorance... Is that better? Yeah. I think the greatest enemy is ignorance. And as ignorance is shared by the politicians and the electors, and if somebody takes a position which is outside the rationality, but which pleases people, then when you're just coming up to an electoral period, there will be some spectacular declarations. I'm Belgian, and the main container port in the world is Antwerp. And of course, there's cocaine trafficking, which is very important, and of course, murders. And Belgian politicians said that we need to condemn the users. They're responsible for these deaths. That's a stupid thing to say, but this brings in the votes. And if we can't change public opinion, when I see sometimes that doctors are in complete ignorance of what the treatment can be, then we won't have changed anything. And when we talk about the certainties, the truths that people keep projecting, things change. That's all I could say. With what we've heard here and the way in which all of these documents have been presented, I think that it shows that the mindsets and positions are changing throughout the world. And that's a very clear trend. Now, Miguel, and particularly in France, you see sometimes some rather rigid attitudes. This is no surprise. We have spent our lives trying to change people's minds, sometimes to attack those mindsets. And theoretically, a law is going to be proposed in France. I don't know when, because there are a lot of events and a lot of problems of violence, and you saw that throughout the world, and political events throughout the world. So I'm not very favorable to... but there's a discussion. This law should have been presented this year to see some progress in the health system, and particularly the positions with regard to various drugs and so on. With regard to the Rock report, we were supposed to hear Bernard Rock, but unfortunately he's still a little ill. We've certainly changed attitudes considerably, but it doesn't serve much purpose. But all the surveys in France give 70 to 80% of people who want to change the system, and the opinion polls, and they have a much more open attitude with regard to the different drugs, and particularly with regard to cannabis. So we can, I think, only be happy. It's not enough, but that's the change in the country. And when Ruth Dreifuss said that Switzerland is a conservative country, with regard to France, it's not true. It's not true at all. We are much more conservative, and not only in the area of cannabis or the different drugs that we've been talking about. We are a country which has political attitude or social attitudes which are very conservative. So I think that this afternoon, Patrick Hébrard is going to have the task of chairing the session. Perhaps we could talk about that this afternoon. I'd be very happy to say, one by one, my friends are here, talk about all the obstacles that we have confronted, and the result has been complete indifference. At the end of things, nothing has changed in reality. So I'd be very happy to talk about it. But anyway, I think it's time for lunch. So I hope you enjoy your meal, and I'd like to thank you all. Thank you.